The 1,970 seconds was a decade when horror redefined itself, raw, unpolished, and often too disturbing for mainstream audiences. Some films became instant classics, while others were buried, forgotten, or dismissed as failures. But here's the twist. Many of those flops remain more terrifying than the hits we remember. Tonight, we're uncovering 12 overlooked 70 seconds horror movies that are still capable of chilling your bones. Let's Scare Jessica to Death, 1971. At first glance, this film was dismissed as a low-budget oddity. It didn't have the flashy gore of its rivals, nor the Hollywood machine to push it. But beneath its modest surface lurked something far more unsettling, a quiet, creeping horror that audiences weren't ready to face. The story follows Jessica, a fragile woman recovering from a mental breakdown, who retreats to a remote farmhouse. Strange figures haunt her visions. Is she seeing ghosts, vampires, or just her own fractured mind? The film never gives a clear answer, and that ambiguity became its curse. Studios didn't know how to market it. Was it supernatural horror? Psychological terror? Viewers left unsettled, unsure what they had just witnessed. Rumors swirled that the script was reworked mid-shoot, that actors were encouraged to improvise their most disturbed behaviors. Critics at the time called it confused and directionless. Drive-in audiences rejected it, demanding blood and monsters. Instead, they got whispers in the dark, unseen presences, and Jessica's quiet unraveling. But years later, scholars began calling it ahead of its time, a proto-feminist horror story about isolation, gaslighting, and madness. Horror fans rediscovered it on late-night TV, and whispers grew into a cult reputation. Today, Let's Scare Jessica to Death feels like an early warning of the psychological horror wave that would dominate decades later. Its silence, its ambiguity, its refusal to explain, those are the things that make it terrifying even now. The line between reality and delusion never felt so thin. The Sentinel, 1977. When this film premiered, it was marketed as just another possession story cashing in on the success of The Exorcist. But audiences were shocked by something else entirely, the grotesque imagery and disturbing final act. The plot follows Allison, a model who moves into a Brooklyn brownstone. Her neighbors seem strange, and the building feels suffocating. Soon, she learns the terrifying truth. The apartment is a literal gateway to hell, and she's being groomed to guard it. Controversy exploded when it was revealed that director Michael Winner had cast actual disabled and disfigured people to play the demons of hell. Some critics called it exploitative, others defended it as horrifyingly real. Studio executives panicked, fearing protests, and the film was quietly shuffled out of theaters. Behind the scenes, stories circulated about Winner's confrontational directing style, with actors clashing over the film's more shocking scenes. Critics dismissed it as cheap exploitation, but audiences who saw it never forgot the imagery. Over time, the movie built a reputation as one of the strangest, most unsettling horror films of the decade. It wasn't just the supernatural, it was the way it blurred real human suffering with monstrous terror. Today, The Sentinel remains a divisive work. Some call it grotesque, others call it a masterpiece of religious dread. But one thing's certain, once you've seen its final act, you can't unsee it. The horror lives on in memory, like a doorway you dare not open again. The Brood, 1979. David Cronenberg's films were always controversial, but The Brood struck a nerve even among his fans. Released in the late 70s, it was met with shock, confusion, and outright disgust. Yet beneath its grotesque surface lay one of the most personal horror stories ever filmed. The movie centers on Frank, a father fighting for custody of his daughter, while his ex-wife Nola undergoes experimental psychoplasmics therapy. The treatment causes her repressed rage to manifest, physically birthing a brood of monstrous, childlike killers. Audiences were horrified. Was this about divorce, motherhood, abusive relationships? The violence was brutal, but the true terror came from the allegory. Rumors spread that Cronenberg had written the film during his own bitter custody battle, channeling his rage and grief directly into the story. Critics at the time blasted it as misogynistic and grotesque. Some theaters even refused to show it, calling it indecent. Yet fans of underground horror whispered about its brilliance, that Cronenberg had turned domestic pain into body horror like no one before. The legacy of The Brood has only grown. Today it's considered a cornerstone of psychological horror, blending family trauma with nightmarish imagery. The monster children, wrapped in snowsuits, remain some of the most disturbing creations of the decade. What makes it last is not the gore, but the emotional truth. Horror born not from haunted houses or demons, but from the scars of family, the monsters of our own making. Messiah of Evil, 1973. When Messiah of Evil was first released, it barely registered. Marketed poorly, shuffled between distributors, and overshadowed by louder horror hits, it quickly slipped into obscurity. But those who stumbled across it discovered something strange, dreamlike, and unforgettable. The story follows Arletty, who travels to a coastal California town to search for her missing father. What she finds is a community in decay, pale, silent townsfolk who gather at night for rituals linked to a mysterious, dark stranger. The movie unfolds like a nightmare, where nothing feels solid. Characters vanish, conversations loop, reality bends. At the time, audiences didn't know what to make of it. Some whispered that directors Willard Huyck and Gloria Katz-Better, known for writing American Graffiti, were channeling something deeply personal, maybe even occult. Critics dismissed it as incoherent. Drive-in crowds walked out, demanding action rather than atmosphere. Behind the scenes, the film was plagued with financial chaos. Budget cuts, forced unfinished edits, and certain sequences were released with sound missing. Distributors hacked it apart, retitling it several times in a desperate attempt to sell tickets. For years, the film existed only in battered VHS copies, traded between horror collectors like forbidden relics. But here's the twist: those flaws only added to its power. The disjointed edits, the surreal pacing, the eerie sound design, they created a dreamlike disorientation that modern audiences now recognize as genius. Today, Messiah of Evil is hailed as one of the most haunting, surreal horror films of the 1970 seconds. It lingers not with jump scares, but with mood. A woman silently eating raw meat in a supermarket, a crowd assembling in a darkened theater, images that feel less like scenes and more like fragments of a nightmare you can't shake. In the end, Messiah of Evil terrifies because it feels like being trapped in someone else's dream, one you'll never wake from. The Manitou, 1978. This film sounded ridiculous on paper, and maybe that's why critics mocked it upon release. A horror story about a woman growing a Native American spirit from a tumor on her back? Even in the Anything Goes 1970 seconds, that sounded too strange. But the Manitou turned that strangeness into one of the decade's most surreal nightmares. Karen, an ordinary woman, develops a mysterious growth on her neck. Doctors are baffled until they discover it's not a tumor at all. It's the reincarnation of a vengeful native shaman, Manitou, clawing his way back into the world. Her friend Harry, a phony psychic, must confront forces far beyond his cheap parlor tricks. Audiences in 1978 didn't know what to think. Was it horror? Camp? Science fiction? The film's bizarre mixture of spiritual possession, medical horror, and psychedelic visual effects left critics laughing. Reviews called it nonsense, and box office numbers collapsed within weeks. Yet, whispers followed. Behind the scenes, producers clashed with censors over the film's violent imagery and depictions of native rituals. Some scenes were cut entirely in U.S. prints, while European versions kept the more graphic shots intact. Cast members later admitted they weren't sure whether they were making art or pulp exploitation, but that tension created something unique. With time, The Manitou found its audience among horror fans who embraced its madness. Today, it stands as one of the strangest examples of 70 seconds horror, excess, equal parts disturbing and absurd. Its final act, set in a cosmic void filled with lightning and supernatural storms, remains visually astonishing. The legacy of The Manitou lies in its audacity. It dared to blend folklore, body horror, and psychedelia into something that doesn't resemble any other horror film. Flawed? Absolutely. But unforgettable. Like a fever dream that refuses to fade, it terrifies because it feels completely unhinged. Shockwaves, 1977. At a time when audiences craved slashers and possession stories, Shockwaves dared to take horror somewhere else into the open sea. Released with little fanfare, it was dismissed as a low-budget oddity. But beneath the surface, this movie about aquatic Nazi zombies became one of the decade's most haunting survival tales. The story begins with tourists stranded after their boat runs aground near a remote island. They soon discover the island hides an abandoned hotel and a horrifying secret. a unit of Nazi Death Corps soldiers, engineered during World War II to survive underwater, still roam the seas as undead predators. Critics in 1977 barely noticed it. Reviews called it slow and uneventful. Distribution was spotty, with many theaters shelving it after only a week. Rumors suggest studio executives didn't know how to market Nazi zombies without offending war veterans, so posters were quietly toned down. Behind the scenes, filming was grueling. Actors performed most of the underwater sequences without stunt doubles, often holding their breath for long takes. Makeup effects degraded in salt water, forcing constant reapplication. Yet that rawness created a sense of eerie authenticity. The soldiers really did look like corpses dragged from the sea. For decades, Shockwaves was nearly forgotten, available only in scratchy VHS transfers. But horror fans rediscovered it in the 2000s, calling it one of the earliest and most original zombie variants in cinema. Modern critics praise its atmosphere: the sun-bleached island, the endless ocean, the silent march of the undead. Today, it feels eerily prescient. Long before Resident Evil or modern Nazi zombie games, Shockwaves imagined that exact nightmare. And unlike campier imitators, this film plays it straight. No jokes, no winks. Just the slow, suffocating dread of realizing escape is impossible. Shockwaves terrifies not through gore, but through inevitability. The sea becomes a graveyard, and the past, no matter how deeply buried, always rises again. Rituals, 1977. When Rituals was first released in Canada, it was marketed as a cheap Deliverance imitation. Critics dismissed it. Theaters gave it limited runs. For years, it was almost impossible to find. Yet horror fans who discovered it whispered the same thing. This was one of the most terrifying survival films of the decade. The story follows 5 doctors on a wilderness trip through the Canadian backcountry. What begins as a test of endurance quickly becomes a nightmare when they realize someone is stalking them, a figure who knows the land, who sets traps, and who takes pleasure in their suffering. Unlike traditional slashers, the mokable violence here is slow, calculated, and deeply personal. At the time, audiences were unsettled, not just by the brutality, but by the subtext. These weren't random victims, they were professionals, healers, men of science. Yet, in the wild, stripped of their status, they were helpless. Some critics accused the film of nihilism. Others thought it was too ugly for commercial release. Distribution companies struggled to package it. The result? Rituals vanished into obscurity, often showing only on late-night Canadian TV. Behind the scenes, production was notoriously difficult. The crew endured harsh conditions in the wilderness, freezing rivers, insect infestations, and long night shoots. Lead actor Hal Holbrook later admitted it was one of the most physically demanding roles of his career. But here's the twist. Decades later, horror scholars began re-evaluating Rituals. They called it a hidden masterpiece of eco-horror, where nature itself becomes the enemy. Its gritty realism and bleak message that civilization offers no protection from primal vengeance still resonates. Today, Rituals is finally being restored and reappraised. It's not a cheap Deliverance clone, it's a film about vulnerability, guilt, and the terror of being hunted in a world without rules. Once forgotten, it now feels more relevant than ever. Martin, 1977. When George A. Romero released Martin, audiences expecting another Night of the Living Dead were confused, even disappointed. Instead of zombies, they got a quiet, unsettling tale of a boy who might or might not be a vampire. The ambiguity left critics baffled, and the film was quickly pushed aside. The story follows Martin, a pale, awkward teenager sent to live with his elderly cousin in Pennsylvania. Martin insists he's an 84-year-old vampire, but unlike cinematic Dracula figures, he has no fangs, no supernatural powers. He drugs his victims with syringes, then slits their wrists to drink their blood. Is he really a vampire? Or is he just mentally ill? Romero refuses to answer. Censors in some countries found the film deeply disturbing, not because of gore, but because of its realism. Scenes of Martin attacking women were shot with raw intimacy, blurring the line between horror and violation. In the UK, the film faced cuts. In the US, it was released quietly, with little promotion, and vanished within weeks. Behind the scenes, Romero was working with a shoestring budget. Much of the cast were locals or friends. Some scenes were shot guerrilla style without permits. This gave the film a gritty authenticity, but also frustrated distributors who wanted something more polished. Over the years, though, Martin grew in stature. critics revisited it, calling it Romero's most personal work, a film about alienation, repression, and the blurred line between fantasy and madness. Horror fans embraced it as one of the most unique takes on the vampire myth ever filmed. Today, Martin feels eerily timeless. The horror doesn't come from monsters, it comes from doubt. Is Martin a supernatural predator or just a boy destroyed by belief? That question lingers long after the credits roll. Don't Look Now, 1973. On release, Don't Look Now divided critics like few films of its era. Some hailed it as a masterpiece. Others dismissed it as pretentious. Audiences expecting a traditional horror story were left unsettled, even confused. But over time, its reputation grew into legend, becoming one of the most haunting films of the 1970 seconds. The story follows John and Laura, grieving parents who travel to Venice after the drowning of their daughter. There, John begins seeing visions, a small figure in a red coat darting through the canals. Is it a ghost, a premonition, or just a symptom of his grief? What shocked audiences wasn't just the atmosphere, but the infamous love scene between Donald Sutherland and Julie Christie. Censors in multiple countries debated whether it was simulated or real. Rumors spread that the actors had actually slept together on camera, fueling controversy. Studios panicked, cutting the sequence in some markets. Meanwhile, others objected to the film's bleak ending, so much so that U.S. distributors tried to soften the marketing. Behind the camera, director Nicholas Roeg leaned into disorientation. Non-liner editing, fragmented visions, and sudden jumps created a constant sense of unease. Viewers were never sure what was real and what was memory. At the time, this alienated mainstream audiences, but for those who stayed, the payoff was unforgettable. Decades later, Don't Look Now is widely regarded as one of the greatest horror films ever made. Its themes of grief, denial, and fate still cut deep. Modern critics praise it as not just horror, but art, a meditation on loss, disguised as a ghost story. The terror of Don't Look Now isn't in monsters or gore. It's in the quiet certainty that grief follows us everywhere, and that sometimes the past doesn't let go. Phantasm, 1979. When Phantasm first arrived, critics didn't know what to make of it. Some dismissed it as a confusing jumble. Others were fascinated by its surrealism. What audiences got was something new, part nightmare, part science fiction, part cosmic horror. And decades later, it remains one of the most iconic cult films of the 1970 seconds. The story follows two brothers, Mike and Jody, who discover something strange about their local funeral home. Its caretaker, the eerie tall man, seems to be stealing corpses and transforming them into dwarf-like slaves for use in another dimension. Armed with shotguns, tuning forks, and sheer courage, they battle not only the tall man but their own disbelief. At the time, censorship boards debated how to classify it. Was it horror? Science fiction? Some countries trimmed its violence, others banned it outright, citing its disturbing blend of child protagonists and surreal gore. Critics complained that its dreamlike structure made no sense, but younger audiences whispered that this was exactly what made it terrifying. Behind the scenes, director Don Coscarelli worked on a shoestring budget, using friends and family as crew. The floating silver sphere, a weapon that drills into skulls, was created with low-tech effects, yet it became one of the most infamous horror props of all time. The film's reception was mixed, but over the years, Phantasm grew into legend. Its sequels expanded the mythology, but none matched the haunting originality of the first. Today, it's remembered not as a failure, but as a bold experiment in dreamlike horror, a movie that blurred the line between reality and nightmare. The true terror of Phantasm lies not in its monsters, but in its disorientation. Like a dream you can't escape, it lingers haunting, confusing, and unforgettable. Alice, Sweet Alice, 1976. When this low-budget slasher was released, it barely registered at the box office. Critics dismissed it as just another cheap imitation of Psycho. Yet within its shadows lay one of the most disturbing and atmospheric horror films of the 1970 seconds. The story begins with the brutal murder of a young girl during her first communion. Suspicion falls on her troubled sister, Alice, who wears a translucent mask and yellow raincoat. But as the killings continue, it becomes clear that something darker is haunting the family and their church community. Audiences were shocked by its willingness to mix Catholic imagery with graphic violence. Religious groups protested, calling it blasphemous. Some theaters pulled it after only a week, Censors in the UK demanded cuts to the stabbing sequences. Even in the US, the film's release was erratic, with multiple title changes to distance it from controversy. Behind the scenes, the young Brooke Shields made her film debut as the doomed little sister, a fact that later revived interest when Shields became a star. Director Alfred Soule struggled with distribution battles, watching his film shuffled between exploitation houses and art house theaters. But whispers began to spread. Horror fans called it one of the most unnerving slashers ever made years before Halloween would cement the genre. Its grim atmosphere, shocking violence, and ambiguous ending made it unforgettable. Today, Alice, Sweet Alice is hailed as a hidden gem, a movie that dared to expose the darkness lurking beneath religious ritual and suburban family life. The image of Alice's mask remains iconic, a symbol of childhood innocence twisted into something terrifying. The film reminds us that sometimes the most horrifying monsters aren't strangers, they're hiding within our families, our communities, and our beliefs. Possession 1979, released 1981 internationally. Though filmed in 1979, Possession didn't see wide release until the early 80s due to censorship battles. Still, it belongs firmly to the era of raw, unflinching 70 seconds horror. When it premiered, audiences were horrified. Some walked out. Others claimed it was one of the most disturbing films ever made. The story follows Anna, Isabel Adjani, a woman unraveling during her separation from her husband, Mark. What begins as a domestic drama quickly spirals into madness, infidelity, and the grotesque culminating in Anna's possession by a shapeless, otherworldly creature. Censors in multiple countries banned or heavily cut the film, calling it obscene and indecent. In the UK, it was briefly labeled a video nasty. In the US, distributors trimmed nearly a third of its runtime, reducing it to a confusing mess. Rumors swirled that its shocking subway scene where Anna writhes in a horrifying breakdown was too realistic, too visceral. Behind the camera, director Andrzej Żuławski was channeling his own divorce. The result was a film so raw, so emotionally charged, that actors reportedly suffered breakdowns during production. Adjani herself later admitted the role nearly destroyed her, even as it won her Best Actress at Cannes. For years, Possession was whispered about more than it was seen. Bootleg tapes circulated among horror fans, who described it as both brilliant and unbearable. But time has turned it into a legend, one of the greatest depictions of madness and despair ever filmed. Today, Possession stands not just as horror, but as art. Its monsters are not only literal, but emotional, the horrors of love, loss, and obsession given physical form. Watching it is like staring into the abyss of human relationships, and that abyss still stares back. The 1970 seconds wasn't just about the horror blockbusters we still celebrate. It was a decade that buried strange, daring films in the shadows. Rediscovered decades later, these overlooked nightmares remind us that fear takes many forms: silence, grief, madness, or truth too raw to face. Which of these hidden gems haunts you most? Comment below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.